Howdy, howdy. So I want to talk a little bit about how one franchise move actually created 7 different franchises. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I want to start talking about what happened in the 1950s when it came to baseball. So from 1902 to 1952, all of the franchises basically stayed in their major league cities. The last major league team to move before that time was when the old Baltimore Oriole franchise moved to New York and became the New York Highlanders, which would eventually become the New York Yankees. But in the 1950s, a whole bunch of things happened to change. A whole bunch of these cities that were able to support 2 baseball teams were no longer able to support 2 baseball teams. And of course, the first team that ended up moving was the Boston Braves that ended up moving to, let's get a little. The Boston Braves ended up moving to Milwaukee. They became the Milwaukee Braves. And then that happened in 1953. The very next year, 1954, you had the St. Louis Browns, which ended up moving to Baltimore and became the Orioles. And then in 1955, you had the Athletics, which ended up moving to Kansas City. So you had 3 of these teams that were originally the second team in their city that ended up moving. 1957, of course, was the big move. In 1957, you had both the Dodgers and the Giants moving to out west, basically. And the shock of New York City losing 2 of its 3 franchises really did hurt. And so in 1958, this new league idea came up. The idea was to bring the National League back to New York City. William Shea was an attorney in New York City, and he actually proposed this idea of a Continental League. This would be a third league which would work alongside the American League and the National League. And what they were planning on doing was they were planning on bringing teams to Denver, to Houston, to Minneapolis, St. Paul, to New York City, and to Toronto. This is 1958, so this is right after New York had lost 2 of its franchises. And these were the first 5 cities that actually came up, and they had the requirements. They had a $50,000 application fee. They had $2.5 million in capital investment. And they had plans to build a 35,000-seat capacity stadium. These 5 cities had already committed to that, and they were fully willing to do this. They were expected to start play in 1961, and they eventually added a few additional cities. So they added Atlanta, they added Dallas-Fort Worth, and they added Buffalo. And then they decided they needed some big name recognition, so they got Branch Rickey, who you're familiar with his work in establishing the minor league system for a lot of franchises, and of course his work with the Brooklyn Dodgers to integrate baseball. So he was going to be the league president. And of course, what happens is Major League Baseball reacts. Major League Baseball decides, you know what, we need to expand first to kind of nip this thing in the bud. And so they do. They decide that they're going to take the existing Senators franchise and move them to Minneapolis, St. Paul. And so that team eventually became the Minnesota Twins. They decided then they were going to expand to Washington and Los Angeles. The American League had no presence out west, and so the idea was this would give them a foothold out west. The National League decided they were going to come up with 2 franchises. Of course, the original intent was to put the National League back in New York. You got the New York Metropolitans, would eventually become the New York Mets, and you had the Houston Colt 45, so they would be the southernmost team in the United States. And with these Major League Baseball plans, the Continental League dissolves. Basically, it disbands in August of 1960, and the Major League Baseball decides, okay, we're going to expand. So in 1961, the American League expands to 10 teams. And of course, that's the first season that we have 162 games instead of 154 games. That's the year that Roger Maris hits his 61 home runs, the whole idea of having an asterisk. And you eventually have the Los Angeles Angels and you have the Los Angeles Angels and you have the Washington Senators. Now, I have this one card because as of 1962, only one of these 4 teams that are expanding actually got a team card, and that was the Los Angeles Angels. And in 1962, the following year, the Houston Colt 45s and the New York Mets come into existence. But anyway, this idea of these teams coming to existence, this idea of expansion that Major League Baseball is saying, okay, we are no longer these monolithic themes where we're only going to have these 16 teams. Now they're each expanded to 18 teams. And there's still talk of franchises moving. In particular, one of the franchises that's talking about moving is the Kansas City Athletics, because they're having a horrible time in Kansas City, and so they've decided, you know what, we're going to move. 1961, they got talks to move to Dallas-Fort Worth. There was no actual formal vote. 1964, they have plans to go to Louisville, and those plans fall out. They then plan to go to Oakland. They're voted down 9-1 by the other major league owners in the American League. In 1967, though, plans to get a new stadium built in Kansas City break down, and they say, you know what, we're moving to Oakland. So 1967 is the last year of the Kansas City Athletics. They would become the Oakland Athletics in 1968. And here comes Stuart Symington. He's the senator from Missouri, and he's really upset because his state has lost Major League Baseball. And he's a senator, so he has power to bring law, and he decides he's going to threaten Major League Baseball's antitrust exemption. He's going to threaten the reserve clause. These are two of the big basic laws that allows baseball to basically behave as they have for the past 70 years. And Major League Baseball decides, they end up settling a lawsuit. And they decide, we're going to enlarge our leagues by 4 teams in 1971. In 1971, they had planned to expand to include 4 cities, one of them being the Kansas City Royals. They were going to include the Seattle Pilots, the San Diego Padres, and the Montreal Expos. And Senator Symington said, you know what, that's not good enough because we just had a team here in 1967. We need a team here by 1969. The problem is that those other 3 cities weren't ready. Of course, Kansas City already had a Major League Baseball stadium that they could use, and they planned on building a larger one. That larger one ends up being Kauffman Stadium, which is currently being used by the Royals to this day. Seattle wasn't ready. They had a minor league stadium that they had planned on using. They had planned on having a Major League stadium built by 1971, but they just could not accommodate the Pilots. And so what happened is the Seattle Pilots ended up moving to Milwaukee in 1970, purchased by Bud Selig, the same Bud Selig who was the commissioner of baseball for the longest time. And so the American League got sued by Seattle, by King County, and by the state of Washington. And as part of that settlement, they decided we're going to expand in 1977, and that produces 2 teams, the Seattle Mariners to replace the Seattle Pilots, and the Toronto Blue Jays. So because this expansion was moved up, Seattle wasn't ready, and it caused some problems. Montreal also wasn't ready. Montreal had Jerry Park, which was a minor league park. It really was too small. This was only supposed to be a temporary home. The actual stadium that they were supposed to build wasn't supposed to be built until 1974. They ran into a lot of issues, and the Olympic Stadium, which is what they ended up using, had delays. It wasn't even ready for the Olympics. Finally, the Expos were able to move there in 1977, but they continued to have issues with their stadium, just the fact that they were in a different country, and it made things difficult for them to acquire players, and eventually the Montreal Expos left Montreal. They became the Washington Nationals. San Diego also was not ready. San Diego had ownership issues, and for a while they were not even paying their players. There were huge fan apathy issues. There was a game in September of 1973 where they had 1,413 paid attendance. And that's just ridiculously crazy. Also at this time, the Washington Senators franchise, that expansion franchise that we talked about earlier, had moved to Texas and become the Texas Rangers in 1972. And so San Diego was planning to sell to a new ownership group. Well, this new ownership group, his name was Everett, he was not able to guarantee that the San Diego franchise would stay in San Diego for at least 2 more years. And so the transfer to him was rejected 8-3 by AL owners. And eventually this team was going to move to Washington. They were going to become the Washington Stars, and this new Washington NL franchise was going to replace the Washington franchise that left. They were going to play in RFK Stadium, and eventually San Diego was able to secure firm ownership. Roy Kroc, who's the McDonald's magnate, was the one who came in and basically stepped up and purchased the San Diego Padres and ended up funding them and keeping them in Seattle. So the net effect is, of course, that these athletics, this move to Oakland in 1967, ended up creating 7 franchises. Of course, they created the Oakland Athletics, but they are also responsible for the existence of the Kansas City Royals, of the Milwaukee Brewers, the San Diego Padres, the Montreal Expos, the Toronto Blue Jays, and the Seattle Mariners. So this one franchise is responsible for 7 new franchises in Major League Baseball. Thanks for watching.